Welcome to another episode of On the History Trail. I'm your host and tour guide, Mark Nonestide. On February 28, 2010, East Brunswick Township celebrated its 150th anniversary. And today we're at the East Brunswick Museum to look at an exhibit that talks about life in the township in the year 1860. So sit back and relax and follow me as we travel on the History Trail. So we're in the township's historic district at the East Brunswick Museum, where we're going to look at an exhibit that talks about life in the township in the year 1860. We're going to get a chance to discuss what was happening in the town right before East Brunswick was created on February 28, 1860. And we'll discuss what types of items were in people's homes at that time, the businesses and merchants that were in East Brunswick in 1860. We'll look at a schoolhouse scene also from that time period and discuss the types of clothing that were worn by the residents of the township in the year 1860. So why don't you follow me as we get started and we explore the exhibit. So before we talk about the creation of East Brunswick Township, we have to understand what was happening in the area before the town was created. And this is a great object, really, to start with. This is a map of Middlesex County from 1850. It's what historians call the Otley-Kiley map, after the names of the two surveyors that are listed here on the map. This is actually a color copy of the original map. The museum owns the original map, but to better preserve it, we have this color copy on display instead. And so this shows the area that would become East Brunswick. And we can see this area right in here, which at that time was North Brunswick Township. And this is the area that would later become East Brunswick Township, just 10 years later. By the mid-1800s, there were more and more people that were settling in this region, and they were clearing out the wooded lots that were here for agricultural endeavors. And as more and more people began to settle in this region, that spurred the formation of the township on February 28, 1860. If we look closely at the map, there are some roads and names of families that are noted on this map, some of which are familiar to us today. If we look right down here, this straight road right here is Ruse Lane, and at the end of Ruse Lane was the Rue Farm, where the Brunswick Square Mall is today. And we can see the Rue House denoted on the map. We also have Cranberry Road right here. This is the Old Bridge Turnpike as it comes out of the southeastern corner of the township and travels up towards New Brunswick past South River. And then Milltown is located right over in this vicinity here. And this is Fresh Ponds Road, which at the time was called Beaver Dam Road. If we look at the map, we can see that there was quite a bit of forest that still existed in East Brunswick by 1850, and much of this would be cleared out over the next 10 years for agricultural endeavors. So East Brunswick Township was created on February 28, 1860, and after that time, after the Civil War, there were a number of atlases that were published of different towns in Middlesex County, and this map is from one of those atlases. In fact, you can see the crease line here from where it had been folded into the book, into the atlas, and this shows East Brunswick Township in the later part of the 1800s. And we can see that there are names denoted on the map, very similar to the earlier map that we saw of Otley and Kiley from 1850. But on this map, you can see that there's a lot more names. There is clearly a lot more settlement that has taken place in this area after the Civil War. At the time that East Brunswick Township was created, it was much larger. It took in what was the town of South River, which at that time was called Washington. It took in what's the town of Spotswood, Helmetta, and a part of Milltown. Each of these communities would break away at later points in time. Helmetta was the first to break away in 1888, South River and Milltown in the 1890s, and finally Spotswood in 1908. So here at the East Brunswick Museum, there is a wonderful collection of artifacts that outline the history of the township. And part of that collection includes furniture items and furniture pieces that actually came from homes here in the town. This chair is a great example. It dates from around 1860, the year our town was formed. And it is a typical chair from that time period. It came from the S.T. Christian Farm, which was on Summerhill Road. In fact, the farmhouse still stands today. And what's so great about this chair is that so much of it is original. If we examine it closely, we can see that it has its original finish to it. It has what appears to be, if not the original, a very early upholstery and covering on it. In fact, inside of here are springs, and it's actually stuffed with horsehair to provide the cushion. We can see the tacking that's around the edge of it. And if we follow down the leg, it also has its original brass casters as well. This part of the exhibit explores the household goods that we would have found in people's homes. And we know about this information through will inventories. Will inventories were usually done after a person passed away, and they list the types of goods that were within the house. And using these records, we can get an understanding of what that material was. And we have some of the material here in this case. This is an iron that was actually found in an area home here in East Brunswick. That dates from about the mid-1800s. It has a wooden handle. The rest of it is iron. But what's unique about it is the back of it lifts up so that you could place the hot coals in here and then put the gate back down, and then this would heat up and you were all prepared to iron your clothing. Other types of items that we find are pewter dishes. Pewter was very common in the 1600s and early 1700s, but actually by the time our town was formed in 1860, pewter was really falling out of fashion. It was an old type of material associated with an earlier time period. But it was used in homes, and we do find reference to it in the mid-1800s, and this is a very large pewter charge, or a large pewter plate. Pewter was replaced by ceramic pieces, which became more common in the 19th century. By the time East Brunswick was formed in 1860, we find yellowware being quite common, and this is a yellowware cake crock that would have been used to store a cake. It's missing the lid, but this piece dates to about 1850. Another type of ceramic that was gaining popularity by the mid-1800s was ironstone. As the name suggests, ironstone was a more durable type of ceramic over the earlier softer-bodied ceramics. Much of ironstone china came from England. This is an English platter that dates to about 1863. And if we flip it over and look at the back side of it, we can see the maker's mark, stone china. And right above it is a patent that's in the shape of a diamond. So they were registering the design of this plate with the English Patent Office. And so the letters and the numbers that are at each corner of the diamond represent the month, the day, and the year that the design on this was patented. And through that, we can determine the age. And again, this particular piece was patented in 1863. This part of the exhibit, we talk about lighting, and in 1860 there were a variety of different kinds of lighting mechanisms that were used. In fact, 1860 was a real transitional year for different types of lighting. At one end we see candles. In fact, candles are a common item that were purchased at local stores in East Brunswick. These are candlesticks that date from about the mid-1800s, and what's unique about this pair of candlesticks is on the bottom these have a push rod, so that when you place the candle here, when it was burned down to a nub, you could press up on this knob and it would pop the remaining nub out the top of the candlestick. Made it very easy to clean it out and to get it ready to place another candle in there. In the mid-1800s, whale oil was also a common item that was found for lighting. And this is a whale oil lamp that dates from around 1850. This was actually made by the Sandwich Glass Company on Sandwich and Cape Cod. They were a company that revolutionized pressed glass in the mid-1800s. So this is a very early whale oil lamp. We're missing the burning mechanism, but this blue part was the reservoir that would have held the whale oil. By 1860, these older methods of burning whale oil and other types of fluid began to fade out, and kerosene lamps became somewhat more common. This is a kerosene lamp that dates from the late 19th century, and we see also in the local ledgers of general stores people purchasing things like glass chimneys, because these would sometimes break, the wicks, which could be adjusted by turning the knob here, and also kerosene, which would have went into the reservoir located here. In 1860, there were a number of general stores that operated in East Brunswick Township. The largest concentration of them was located in the southeastern corner of the township in the Old Bridge Historic District. This is a surviving store ledger from one of the general stores that was located in that neighborhood. It dates to 1868, and it shows all kinds of goods that were being available to the people that lived in the area. And if we take a close look at it, we can see some items like 3 pounds of sugar, which costs 42 cents. Here we see John Sellover purchased 1 straw hat for 30 cents. Isaac Sellover also purchased some sugar, mackerel, and butter. If we go over here to James, what looks like the last name of Wigan, he purchased a variety of different kinds of material, one of which was 6 pair of army brogans for $7.20. And army brogans, these are shoes from the Civil War. They were brogans were shoes that were worn by Civil War soldiers, and apparently one of the proprietors of a general store in the neighborhood got a surplus of these shoes and was selling them through their general store. General stores sold a whole variety of goods, and at the store, those goods could be stored in a number of ways. This here is a large stoneware jug that's labeled Appleby and Helm that held snuff, which was a ground tobacco product popular in the 19th century. And this particular stoneware jug dates between 1866 and 1879, when the Appleby was in partners with the Helm Company in producing this ground tobacco and producing snuff. Other containers included containers for tea or coffee. This is a tin container, which was patented in 1851. And then we have some other items such as bottles. These are what are known as historic flasks. These were novelty whiskey bottles that were popular from about the 1830s to just after the Civil War. And they often have different scenes that are depicted on the various sides of the bottle. This depicts a glass factory in New Jersey. And some of them have patriotic themes such as eagles, or signs of prosperity like the cornucopia on the other side. We know how old these bottles are by looking at them carefully, especially the bottom parts of the bottle, where we can see what's called a pontil mark. This is a mark that's created by the glass blower when he's blowing the glass into a mold. He would have had a long rod that he would have blown the molten glass into a mold, and then he would have broken off the rod from the glass, and it created what's called a pontil mark. And pontil marks are on hand-blown glass bottles, usually dating from the time just before the Civil War. The ceramic industry was very important here in central New Jersey, and in 1860 there were a number of potteries that were operating in East Brunswick and actually in the surrounding communities. And we have some great artifacts here that talk about that history, that ceramic history in this area. We'll start off with these 2 pieces here, 2 teapots which were actually found at a site in South Amboy that produced this particular type of ceramic. It was known as Swan Hill. It was a Swan Hill pottery. It was located in South Amboy just after the Civil War, and they were well known for making this sort of brownish glaze known as a Rockingham. And these teapots were found at the factory site about 20 years ago, when a housing development, sort of as they were digging the foundations for these buildings, churned up all kinds of fragments of artifacts from the factory. This was a very common teapot style from the mid-1800s that depicted Rebecca at the well. This was a biblical reference from the book of Genesis that was placed on teapots and was very popular in the mid-19th century. So these were produced in nearby South Amboy and would have graced the tables of homes of people living here in East Brunswick. This is a storage crock, 2-gallon storage crock that was made in Matawan by a firm known as Van Schoik and Dunn. It was a firm that was in operation for a long time, since the early 1800s up until the early 1900s. And they were well known for creating these tulip designs on their pottery. And this was a ceramic storage vessel. This was a utilitarian item that would have been found in the kitchens. It was the Tupperware of the 19th century. If we slide down a little bit more, we have pieces here that came from one of the potteries in East Brunswick. And there were two potteries that were located in East Brunswick. There was the Van Wickle and Morgan pottery, which was in existence from 1805 to 1828. And then the Bizet pottery, which was in existence from 1816 to 1867. So it was around at the time that the town was formed in 1860. And this small stoneware utility bottle was actually found by one of the residents in the neighborhood whose house sits very near where the pottery was found. She dug this out of the ground when she was planting some plants in her garden. And it's one of the typical types of ceramic pottery bottles that were being produced at the Bizet factory. Also found there is what we call kiln furniture. These are pieces of clay that would have been molded and placed in the large brick kilns where they were firing these pieces of ceramic. As they would stack these in the kiln, they would place these pieces in between the different pieces that they were stacking. And this would prevent the pieces from fusing together during the high temperatures that were created and firing the ceramics. And so we see all different kinds of kiln furniture here, again, that were used to separate between different types of stoneware jugs and crocks in these kilns. And what's great about these pieces is that if we look at them carefully, we can actually see these impressions that were created by the potter's hands as they're molding the clay. So they're literally taking the raw clay, working it with their hands, and their imprints from their fingers survive in the hardened clay. And some of them, if we actually look at them very carefully enough, we can also see fingerprints impressed into the clay from these potters that were here so very long ago. So we have a number of items here that talk about doctors and medicine in East Brunswick. Our first item here is an old medicine bottle, a laudanum bottle, that dates to about 1870. Laudanum was a painkiller that contained opium, and it was a highly addictive painkiller that was popular in the mid-19th century. This particular bottle was found in the wall of a local home in the historic district, along with a whole cache of these bottles. The museum has one example here. Apparently the homeowner got addicted to the opium in here and hid the bottles by placing them in a hole in the wall and dropping them in. And when the house was renovated about 15 years ago, many of these bottles were found stuffed inside the wall. If you took too much of this, it could kill you. And you'd see on the label of the bottle, it has a skull and crossbones to show that it was dangerous if taken in large quantities. Other bottles or medicine bottles from that time, many of them contained alcohol or drugs. They were highly addictive, and many of them actually did more harm than good. This is a Taylor's Whorehound Balsam from Trenton. This was a cough elixir, and this particular bottle also dates from around 1870. The other item that we have here is a bloodletting knife that belonged to a doctor in the Old Bridge section of East Brunswick in what's now the historic district. We have the original case and the knife itself. Bloodletting was rather common in the 19th century. There's a lancet, a spring-loaded lancet here that would create a little cut in the skin, and they would create a variety of cuts on the body, and they would drain a certain amount of blood. And bloodletting and this draining of what they thought was bad blood was, again, it was a common medical practice in the 19th century. As I mentioned, this is a spring-loaded lancet, so if we pull it back, the spring snaps in, and they would place it on the skin, and there's a little lever in the back that would be pressed, and it would create a little nick in the skin, just enough to create a little bit of bleeding. And they would go up and down the back of the leg or on the arm with this particular knife. I guess thankfully we're glad that bloodletting sort of lost popularity by the early 1900s. In 1860, East Brunswick did not have any locally produced newspapers. Local news would have been covered in area newspapers, or if the story was of great interest, in regional papers. New Brunswick was the nearest center of printing activities, and newspapers had been produced there since the late 1700s. The New Brunswick Fredonian was one of the more popular papers and was available to residents of East Brunswick in 1860. This example dates from 1857, just 3 years before the town was created, and would have been typical of the papers that were available at that time. It consists of advertisements. It also has columns for local news and for national and world news as well. In 1860, the education system in East Brunswick was not really well defined. There was a private school known as Conover's Home Boarding School that was located in what's now the Township's historic district. And then there were several one-room school buildings that were located throughout the township. These schools would eventually become the foundation of the public school system in East Brunswick today. In 1860, funding came from both federal and state sources, although East Brunswick, as well as the rest of the state, would not see dedicated funding until the 1870s. The state had ordered the creation of school districts in 1848, and a one-room wood schoolhouse was constructed in the Old Bridge section shortly afterwards. The building was later converted into a home, and it still stands today in the Township Historic District. And the museum has a painting that was done by a local artist, James Crawford Tom, of that school building in the 1890s called Winter in Old Bridge, and it shows children coming out of the school on a snowy winter day. We also have in our collection the original school bell, and the original key to the front door of the school. The school was a one-room schoolhouse, and so all the children were thrown together in this one room, and it must have made learning rather difficult, or teaching these children rather difficult for the teachers. They had to be able to communicate on different levels to all the children that were in this room. In the exhibit, we have a number of school books that were loaned to the museum specifically for this exhibit. These are school books that were used by children in East Brunswick about the time of the Civil War. One of the earlier books here is from 1864. It's Thompson's Higher Arithmetic, and inside there are exercises for subtraction, decimals, fractional equations. There's even business-related math, such as how to calculate profit and loss. Move on to some other books. We have a book here that was owned by Leighton Appleby, who was an early settler to East Brunswick in the early 1800s. This is a school book that is the history of the United States up to 1866, so it ends just after the Civil War. Has this wonderful wood or false wood grain cover to it. And inside there are images of some of the founding fathers. We can see here George Washington. And lastly, we have a school book that belonged to George Yates, also a resident of the Old Bridge section of East Brunswick. It has a homemade cover on top of it that was placed on by the Yates family. The book dates to 1857. It's a Webster's Dictionary, and what's unique about it is that George Yates went to school in the mid to late 1880s. So he was actually bringing a school book that was some 25 to 30 years older at that time. The school desks in the mid-1800s were benches. By just after the Civil War, by the 1870s and 1880s, desks with cast iron sides that were bolted to the floor were quite common. They had space underneath for an inkwell, so you had the glass ink bottle that would go underneath, and a section that would come up where you could place the ink bottle and dip your pen or quill into the ink and do your writing. And if we actually look at this desk, there's some graffiti and other marks on it from school children that had used it a long time ago. The museum is fortunate to have a strong textile and sewing collection. We'll start off by looking at some fashions for men from the mid-1800s. This is a leather-covered traveling hat box. If we take the lid off and look at the inside, there is a top hat. And this hat belonged to the Herbert family. Obadiah Herbert was a prominent resident in East Brunswick in the mid-1800s. In fact, for some time, the Aldbridge section was called Herbertsville in honor of him. He was a landowner and a business owner in that section of town. And this is a box, a hat box, a traveling hat box, and a hat that belonged to that family. We also have a shoe, a child shoe there, an adult, adolescent-sized shoe that was found in a local home in the historic district. This also dates to about the time of the Civil War and is a very similar style to the army brogans that we talked about earlier that were found in the store ledger. If we move to some of the other items in the museum collection, the Civil War had a big impact on fashion, and East Brunswick Township being created in 1860, just several years later, the country was plunged into this utter chaos during the Civil War. And as mentioned, the Civil War changed the style of clothing that people wore. This is the top of a dress from about that time. It sort of has a military cut in a military fashion. This piping along the sleeves and up here on the shoulders was meant to mimic the piping that was found on soldiers' uniforms from that time period. Women would have kept their sewing supplies in sewing boxes. And this particular box belonged to the Sylvester family, residents of East Brunswick, and it dates from about the 1870s. Inside are various compartments that would have been used to house the different sewing equipment. If we move from the sewing box to the sewing machine, by 1860, sewing machines were in existence. This particular model dates from around 1870. It is a foot-operated sewing machine, so there's a treadle on the lower part of the frame that would spin the wheel and operate the needle. And much of the clothing that we have in the museum collection from the 1860s is both worked on sewing machines. We can see the machine stitching, and there's also examples of hand-stitch clothing items. These two dresses date from the mid-1800s. This is the older of the two. This brown dress dates to about 1860. And right next to it is a morning dress from about 1870. These morning dresses were usually worn for a long period of time, sometimes as long as a year, even longer in some cases. The one here at the museum has a flared bottom to it that is created by the use of a hoop skirt. Which also was a popular style in the mid-1800s. This is a hoop skirt in the museum collection that's made out of wire. Some of the very earliest types of hoop skirts utilized whalebone. This is a later example that dates to about 1870. It looks more like some sort of 19th century torture device, but this would have been worn underneath the dress and allowed it to flare out to sort of give this look of a bell. Again, a popular style in the mid-1800s. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode of On the History Trail, as we got the chance to explore the exhibit here at the museum and learn about life in East Brunswick in 1860. We, of course, invite you to come to the museum and look at not only the exhibit, but the other artifacts that are here. The museum is open Saturdays and Sundays from 1:30 to 4. For further information, you can visit the museum website at eastbrunswickmuseum.org. So come along again and follow me as we travel on the History Trail.